How does someone vanish completely on one of the most monitored mountains in Europe, only to have their final moments emerge from the ice like a message from the dead? Bastian was 26 when he walked into that blizzard carrying a death. Wish disguised as confidence. He'd climbed 17 peaks above 4,000 meters and survived 3 avalanches that should have killed him. His expedition resume filled 43 pages, and sponsorship deals with 3 equipment companies paid for his apartment in Annecy. But professional climbers called him reckless, and photographers loved him because he attempted routes that made for spectacular failure or impossible success. His Instagram account had 89,000 followers who watched him dance with death on vertical rock faces across 6 countries. What they didn't know was that his younger brother Henri had died in a motorcycle accident 8 months earlier, and Bastian had started taking solo routes that expedition guides wouldn't touch with full teams. The ink was still blue when they pulled his journal from the ice 15 years later. Bastian Morel had been dead since March 2009, but his handwriting remained perfect on pages 847 through 851 of his climbing log. The final sentence stopped midword. "The wind is getting stronger and I can't feel my fin." The rescue team found the notebook wedged against a boulder at 2,400 meters on the glacier de Bausson, released by a spring melt that exposed secrets the mountain had swallowed during the worst storm in alpine history. He'd climbed 17 peaks above 4,000 meters and survived 3 avalanches that should have killed him. His expedition resume filled 43 pages, and sponsorship deals with 3 equipment companies paid for his apartment in Annecy. Professional climbers called him reckless, but photographers loved him because he attempted routes that made for spectacular failure or impossible success. His Instagram account had 89,000 followers who watched him dance with death on vertical rock faces across 6 countries. But Bastian carried secrets darker than his public image suggested. His climbing partners noticed he took increasingly dangerous solo routes after his younger brother Henri died in a motorcycle accident in 2008. Where other climbers calculated risks, Bastian seemed to court them. He climbed without backup plans, pushed weather windows beyond reasonable limits, and attempted technical routes that expedition guides wouldn't touch with full teams. His father later found psychological evaluation forms in his apartment, documents required for military service that revealed Bastian had been diagnosed with severe depression and suicidal ideation at age 19. The evaluation described a young man who used extreme physical challenges to quiet mental anguish that medication couldn't touch. His psychiatrist noted that Bastian spoke about mountains as if they were living entities that understood his pain in ways humans couldn't. He told doctors that vertical rock faces and exposed ridges were the only places where his mind stopped, generating thoughts he couldn't control. The military rejected him for psychological instability, but the mountains accepted him unconditionally. On March 15, 2009, weather reports showed conditions that would kill experienced guides, and Bastian went anyway. He left his hotel in Chamonix at 4:30 a.m., carrying 48 pounds of gear and a return train ticket for March 18th that he would never use. Hotel security footage shows him checking weather forecasts on his phone in the lobby, frowning at the screen, then deleting something he'd been typing. The message he deleted was never recovered, but phone records show he'd started composing texts to 17 different contacts and sent none of them. The Aiguille du Midi cable car operator remembered Bastian because he argued about the weather. Closure. The lifts shut down at 11 a.m. due to winds exceeding 80 kilometers per hour, but Bastian had already purchased his ticket. Security footage shows him walking toward the Vallée Blanche at 11:47 a.m., his red jacket the last splash of color. Before the whiteout consumed everything, 3 other climbers turned back that morning after seeing conditions that looked like the end of the world. Bastian kept going. His route should have taken him up the Cosmique Arête to the summit of Mont Blanc du Tacoul, then across the glacier, toward the Grand Capucin. But the storm changed everything. Winds hit 120 kilometers per hour by noon, and visibility dropped to less than 5 meters. The Mountain Rescue Service received 17 emergency calls that day from climbers trapped in conditions that turned familiar terrain into death mazes. They couldn't launch helicopters until the storm passed, and by then, Bastian had been missing for 36 hours. The search began on March 17th, with 42 rescuers and 3 helicopters equipped with thermal imaging systems that could detect body heat through 6 meters of snow. They found his first trace at 2,800 meters, a single pole basket buried under snow near a couloir that should have been nowhere near his planned route. The basket was scratched and bent, suggesting a fall violent enough to snap carbon fiber, but there was no body, no pack, no other equipment. Just that small piece of aluminum that proved Bastian had been there and then wasn't. Search teams expanded their efforts to cover terrain they'd never considered before. They used avalanche probes to test snow stability in areas where no sane climber would venture. They descended into crevasses that had been avoided by guides for decades because of their reputation for swallowing people without trace. They found climbing gear from other accidents, pieces of aircraft from crashes in the 1970s, and the preserved remains of a German climber from 1961 still wearing his leather boots and carrying chocolate that hadn't melted in 48 years. But they found nothing else belonging to Bastien Morel. After 12 days of searching that cost 7,000 euros and involved rescue teams from 4 countries, authorities declared him legally dead and closed the case. His father collected his belongings from the Chamonix Hotel: 2 pairs of jeans, 5 technical shirts, a laptop containing 12,000 photographs of mountain ascents, and a journal with blank pages waiting for adventures that would never happen. That wasn't even the worst part. 5 years later, in 2014, preseason route workers cleaning Rockfall from a climbing approach discovered a backpack wedged under granite slabs at 2,200 meters. The shoulder straps were stained dark with what lab tests confirmed was human blood type O positive, Bastien's blood type. Inside, they found his passport, his climbing permits, and a half-written letter to his father that began, "Papa, if you're reading this, something went wrong on the mountain." The letter contained 3 paragraphs about how proud he was to be his son, how climbing had taught him to face fear, and how the mountains had shown him what it meant to be truly alive. The 4th paragraph started with, "I think I made a mistake today," and ended abruptly, the pen trailing off the page like he'd stopped writing mid-thought. The date on the letter was March 15th, 2009, the day he disappeared. But forensic analysis revealed something disturbing. The letter had been written in 2 different sessions, using 2 different pens, suggesting Bastien had started it before his climb and finished it after something went terribly wrong. The backpack also contained items that made no sense given his planned route. He'd packed winter bivouac gear rated for temperatures down to minus 40 degrees Celsius, enough food for 12 days instead of his planned 3-day climb, and emergency medical supplies, including morphine ampules that required prescription access. Most puzzling was a sealed envelope containing 3,400 euros in cash and instructions for transferring money from his savings account to his father, preparations that suggested Bastien knew he might not return. Rescue teams reopened their investigation and mapped every crevasse, probed every snow bridge, and descended into ice caves that hadn't been explored since the 1970s. They discovered that the Glacier de Bosson contained a maze of hidden chambers and passages carved by meltwater over centuries. Some of these spaces were large enough to shelter a person but completely invisible from the surface. Thermal imaging detected temperature variations, suggesting air circulation in areas where no openings appeared on topographical maps. The mystery deepened in 2016 when glacial movement exposed more debris at the glacier's terminus. A group of hiking tourists spotted what looked like fabric caught in the ice near the Mer de Glace railway station. When guides investigated, they discovered climbing boots, La Sportiva Nepal's size 44, the exact model and size Bastien wore. The laces were still tied in the precise knot pattern he'd learned from his grandfather, a technique specific to their family that involved a double-wrap security loop used by mountain guides in the 1940s. Inside the boots were wool socks, still intact, still holding the shape of feet that had worn them 15 years earlier. The socks contained something that changed everything: traces of frostbite medication and specialized foot warmers that weren't available commercially in 2009. These items had been developed for extreme altitude climbing and weren't released to the general market until 2012. Either someone had planted evidence to confuse searchers, or Bastien had access to experimental equipment through connections nobody knew about. Hidden in the liner of the left boot, wrapped in waterproof tape, was a train ticket from Chamonix to Annecy, dated March 18th, 2009, his planned return date. But the ticket wasn't the original he'd purchased. Microscopic analysis revealed it was a duplicate printed on different paper stock using ink formulations that didn't exist in 2009. Someone had carefully recreated his return ticket using materials and techniques available years after his disappearance. The boots raised questions that investigators couldn't answer. If Bastien had died in a crevasse fall, why were his boots found kilometers from where the other evidence appeared? If he'd been buried in an avalanche, why were the boots separated from his body, and why did they contain equipment from the future? And who had the technical knowledge and motivation to plant fake evidence in glacier ice while making it appear naturally preserved? 3 years passed with no new discoveries, while conspiracy theories flourished online. Some claimed Bastien had faked his death to escape gambling debts revealed in his financial records. Others suggested he'd been recruited by intelligence services for operations requiring mountain warfare expertise. The most elaborate theory involved illegal human trafficking routes through alpine passes that required elimination of witnesses. But none of these explanations accounted for the physical evidence or the precise details documented in official reports. Then climate change delivered the answer nobody expected. The summer of 2019 brought record temperatures to the Alps, and glaciers retreated faster than scientists had measured in recorded history. The Glacier des Bossons lost 14 meters of thickness in 8 weeks, exposing ice layers that hadn't seen daylight since the medieval warm period. Archaeologists found Roman coins, medieval weapons, and the preserved corpse of a Napoleonic soldier still wearing his uniform buttons. On August 23, 2019, a glacier guide named Philippe Dumoulin noticed something dark embedded in the ice wall near the glacier's eastern margin. What he initially thought was rock turned out to be leather, the corner of a notebook, perfectly preserved in ice that had formed around it like protective glass. The journal belonged to Bastien Morel, and it contained 851 pages of climbing. Notes, route descriptions, weather observations, and personal reflections spanning 7 years of mountaineering. But the journal contained secrets darker than anyone imagined. Mixed between route descriptions and equipment reviews were detailed observations of drug trafficking operations Bastien had witnessed during high-altitude climbs. He documented helicopter landings at remote locations, photographed license plates and aircraft registration numbers, and recorded conversations between individuals he suspected were moving illegal substances through mountain passes. His climbing routes had inadvertently taken him through territories controlled by organized crime networks operating above the law enforcement altitude limits. The final 5 entries told a story that no search team had imagined. Bastien hadn't fallen into a crevasse or been buried by an avalanche. He'd discovered something on the mountain that people were willing to kill to protect, and he'd been trapped by the storm in a location where rescue was impossible while slowly running out of supplies. The journal entries from March 15th through March 25th, 2009 documented his desperate attempts to signal for help, his failing equipment, and his growing realization that the people hunting him were more dangerous than the mountain itself. March 15th. Visibility 0, wind stronger than anything I've experienced. Found shelter behind Sirak at approximately 2,600 meters. GPS shows I'm 800 meters east of planned route. Radio dead. Antenna snapped during fall into this position. We'll wait for weather to clear. Saw 3 men with rifles at 2,200 meters before storm hit. They weren't rescue personnel. March 18th. 3rd day. Storm hasn't stopped. 8 last energy bar this morning. Melting snow for water, but fuel running low. Tried to climb out twice, but ice conditions impossible. Wrote letter to Papa in case things go bad. Heard helicopter twice, but it wasn't searching. It was dropping supplies at coordinates I recorded before weather closed in. March 21st. Weak now, getting weaker. Hands not working properly in cold. Can see helicopter searching lower on glacier, but too far away to signal. Flare gun was in pack that fell during initial descent to this position. Found cave system behind ice wall. Packages inside marked with symbols I photographed during Eiger climb last year. March 23rd. Found small cave behind ice wall. Warmer. Here, but very little room to move. Starting to think rescue not coming. Writing everything down in case someone finds this later. Want family to know what happened. The packages contain white powder in quantities that would be worth millions at street level. Names and phone numbers written in margins match individuals from my photographs. March 25th. Hands barely work now. Very tired all the time. Dreams. About home, about Papa's workshop, about summer climbs with warm rock under my fingers. Can hear voices outside cave, but they're not rescue voices. They're searching for something, and they know I'm here. The wind is getting stronger, and I can't feel my fin. That was where the writing ended. Not with a dramatic final message or a philosophical reflection on death, but with an unfinished word and a hand that simply stopped moving. Forensic analysis of the journal showed the final entry was written with a pencil stub barely 2 centimeters long, pressed so hard into the paper that impressions remained visible on the next 3 pages. But chemical analysis revealed something else, traces of sedatives in the paper fibers, suggesting Bastien had been drugged during his final hours. The cave Bastien described was located 6 months later using GPS coordinates he'd recorded in the journal margins. Rescue teams found it exactly where he'd indicated. A natural shelter carved by wind behind a Srac wall at 2630 meters elevation. Inside were the remains of his final camp, a torn sleeping bag, empty fuel canisters, and a small pile of stones, arranged in a pattern his father later recognized as a message they'd used during childhood games meaning danger coming. But the cave contained evidence that transformed the investigation from a rescue mission into a criminal case. Hidden beneath rocks were packages wrapped in waterproof material containing 23 kilograms of pure heroin marked with symbols linking them to trafficking networks operating between Afghanistan and Western Europe. Drug enforcement agencies recognized the markings as signatures of organizations that eliminated witnesses without leaving evidence that could be traced through legal channels. Bastien's body wasn't in the cave, but traces of his DNA were found, mixed with blood evidence from at least 2 other individuals. Forensic reconstruction suggested a violent struggle had occurred in the confined space, ending with the removal of all human remains by persons unknown. The drug packages had been disturbed and resealed, indicating someone had verified their contents before deciding what to do with the witness who discovered them. The mystery of where Bastian went after March 25th remained unsolved until thermal imaging surveys in 2021 detected an anomaly deep inside the glacier itself. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of organic material approximately 43 meters below the current surface, moving slowly downslope with the glacier's natural flow. But the radar signature suggested the remains had been wrapped in synthetic materials and weighted with objects dense enough to prevent natural flotation during ice formation. Bastian Morel had become part of the mountain he loved, but not through accident or misadventure. Someone had buried him in glacier ice using techniques that suggested professional knowledge of how bodies decompose in frozen environments and how evidence can be preserved or destroyed depending on burial depth and ice chemistry. His remains were traveling the same route he'd planned to climb, just 40 meters underground and 15 years behind schedule, wrapped in materials that would preserve forensic evidence until the ice delivered them to investigators who understood what they were looking at. But climate scientists calculate that won't happen until 2087, when Bastian Morel would have been 104 years old. By then, the Glacier des Bossons will have retreated significantly due to global warming, and the ice carrying his body will have moved through temperature cycles that could preserve or destroy evidence depending on atmospheric conditions that nobody can predict with certainty. His journal became the most detailed account ever recovered of drug trafficking operations in high-altitude environments. Law enforcement agencies worldwide studied his observations to understand how criminal organizations use extreme terrain to avoid detection. His photographs and GPS coordinates led to the arrest of 17 individuals connected to trafficking networks operating across 4 countries, but the people responsible for his death were never identified. The notebook itself was sealed as evidence in an ongoing investigation that remains classified 15 years later. Legal documents show that multiple government agencies claimed jurisdiction over the case, creating bureaucratic delays that have prevented release of information to Bastian's family. His father received only redacted copies of the journal entries, with names, locations, and organizational details removed to protect ongoing operations. One entry from 2007, written after his successful ascent of the Walker Spur, contained a passage that proved prophetic. "Every time I climb, I'm making a bet with the mountain. I'm betting that my preparation, my skills, and my judgment are stronger than whatever the peak can throw at me. So far, I'm winning, but I know the mountain is patient. It can wait for the day when my bet doesn't pay off." That day arrived on March 15, 2009, when a 26-year-old climber walked into weather conditions that grounded helicopters and closed mountain railways. But his bet with the mountain wasn't the wager that killed him. His bet was with people who used the mountain's reputation for swallowing climbers without trace to cover crimes that left no witnesses and no evidence above the tree line. The last person to see Bastian Morel alive was a cable car operator who watched him disappear into white wind at 11:47 a.m. The first person to see evidence of his death was a glacier guide who thought he'd found interesting rock formations for Instagram 15 years later. Between those two moments stretched a story of survival, determination, and systematic elimination that played out in frozen silence while the world assumed the mountain had claimed another victim. His return train ticket, still crisp and readable after 15 years in ice, remains sealed in an evidence locker in Lyon. Next to it, in the same container, is a photograph of Bastian at the summit of Mont Blanc, taken 3 months before his final climb, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed the mountains would always let him come home. He was right about the mountains. It was the people hiding in them that he should have feared.